Sustainable World 3A Taxation. The mode of taxation is quite as important as the amount. As a small burden placed badly may distress a horse, that would carry with ease a much larger one, properly adjusted. So a people may be impoverished and their power of producing wealth destroyed by taxation, which, if levied in another way, could be borne with ease. Taken by Henry George, Progress and Poverty. The mode of taxation is quite as important as the amount. As a small burden badly placed may distress a horse, that would carry with ease a much larger one properly adjusted. So a people may be impoverished and their power of producing wealth destroyed by taxation, which, if levied in another way, could be borne with ease. Every April, many Americans dread this time when they must account to the taxman. Many would underpay their tax obligations and would have back taxes to pay, loaded with penalties and interest, which would amount to several times the original amount. Many well-to-do businessmen would have their accountants busily looking for loopholes to limit the amount of tax take, so much so that they end up paying a lower rate than their employees, who are not so fortunate to hire these smart accountants. Many would have taken their savings and invested in stock would see their capital gains subjected to a 15% tax take. Many of the rich hide their incomes in offshore accounts, as far away from the taxman as possible, and many still move their businesses offshore into more tax-friendly and or labor cost-friendly environments, escaping the heavy tax imposition in their country of origin. The evidence too of bribery and the corruption of tax authorities is also quite stark, although prosecution of such cases is rare when compared to other types of corruption. There is a huge industry out there of accountants dealing only with tax issues and nothing else. Could there not be a better system of taxation that will not bring so much distress and heartache to the population, that will not cause such levels of evasion, avoidance, fraud and corruption in the community? A system that will have less tax leakage, more accountability, fairness, cooperation, and participation. Believe it or not, taxation has been a controversial issue in many countries, even before medieval times. As far back as the days of the Roman Empire, taxation has always caused unrest among citizens, with emperors having to find money to stand and feed their armies, as well as fund public works that would bring better infrastructure and benefits to inhabitants. Many of the debates in the Roman senates were indeed about taxation and how to fund the empire's burgeoning land capture and operations. It is felt by many scholars that if the Romans had gotten this taxation matter right, the empire would have lasted longer because their subjects would have been a happier lot. Essentially, the taxation systems back in those days only seemingly benefited those living closer to Rome, the center of power. Those furthest away were neglected, and this inevitably led to economic failure throughout much of the empire. When the invasion from the north via the barbarians began, the Romans could not count on the loyalty from many within the outskirts of the empire, which would have been necessary to repel such a compelling force. In the end, the empire fell only because its taxation system was not wise and intelligent to keep its citizens happy and loyal. Modern day empires would do well to learn from this. The canons of taxation. It was in the first half of the 18th century that Adam Smith, considered the father of economics, wrote his seminal work entitled The Wealth of Nations. Here he laid out the canons of taxation, which were postulations or guidelines for those in charge of economies. These economies could be of all types, large or small, developed or developing, and if followed, would lead to success, not only for the country, but for the individual and the corporation. These canons have found favor with many other well-known socio-economists of the past, namely David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and Henry George, to name a few. These canons, numbering 4, at best are not well known by persons today, or at worst are ignored. They propose that the best way to raise public revenue must be to conform to the following conditions. 1. That it bears as lightly as possible upon production, such that it does not provide disincentives. 2. That the tax be cheaply and easily collected, and it falls directly upon the landowners, taking as little as possible beyond what the needs of the state are. 3. That it be certain and give no opportunity for fraud, malfeasance by the tax officials, eradicating opportunities for evasion and avoidance by the taxpayer. And 4. That it be borne equally to give no one any advantage or put anyone at a disadvantage with other citizens. Everyone knows that the take-home pay at the end of the month is more important than the gross salary. What if our gross salary was not subject to any form of taxation? That there were no pay-as-you-earn or corporation tax deductions, and sales and value-added tax were a thing of the past? Well, the introduction of a side value taxation would place the state in a position to abolish these deleterious forms of taxation. We all acknowledge that taxation of the wealth produced in any economy must take place for the government to pay for the goods and services it provides to the community. But this tax is applied to those factors of production that are least desirous and least able to bear the tax in the first place. Taxes that lessen the rewards of labor act as a disincentive and tends to lessen the production of wealth. Taxes on labor, as we know, have the effect of diminishing wages and salaries, and thus leads to tax evasion and avoidance. Taxes on goods and services in the form of value-added tax and sales tax have the effect of lessening the quantity of these items and places them outside the reach of the common man. It also gives the proprietor the opportunity to impose prices that are greater than the aggregate of the cost of the good or service and the sales tax. Taxes on capital tend to lead to capital flight, to more favorable environments, and a reduction of savings and investments in the community. Taxation then on the factors of labor and capital tend to diminish the production of wealth, and when applied are passed on to the final consumer of this wealth as higher prices. There is nothing that is more inflationary in any economy than this phenomenon. However, taxes imposed on land values have no such impact, but conversely have a fundamentally positive and wide-ranging impact on the labor and capital factors of production. Firstly, it will make more valuable lands available to the population at affordable prices, which is not the case today. Secondly, and in a general sense, it would reduce prices of goods and services throughout the economy because there would in due course be more suppliers of these goods and services, increasing competition. Thirdly, and this would be explained further in due course, more businesses would survive and thrive as more citizens obtain gainful employment with real purchasing power. Taxing land values, which is the most passive of the three factors, would have the effect of optimizing and bringing forth to the market all three factors optimally, and in the process creating the level economic playing field which should be the desire of all well-meaning citizens. The first canon. In every country, whether developed or developing, wealth production to a greater or lesser extent is being hamstrung by taxes that are improperly placed. This has led to shortfalls in revenue, increases in debt, unemployment, and failing businesses. Taxes and tariffs on manufactured goods, on commerce, on general improvement such as capital gains, and particularly on labor, are having deleterious effects. Unfortunately, governments are unaware of the impacts they are having. Taxes placed upon the value of land are having no such effects. These site values are reflective of the quantity and quality of the agricultural produce on business and commercial sites, the tallness of buildings, on urban residential sites, the proximity to central business districts, and on industrial sites, the ease of access to transportation networks and sea outlets. Taxes on the value of land at these locations have no impact on the ability to produce there. At these locations, these site value taxes will not lessen wages or the returns to the capital, but will indeed lessen returns to landowners. I'll just read that last sentence again. At these locations, these site value taxes will not lessen wages or the returns to capital, but will indeed lessen returns to landowners. The question as to why the landowner should suffer their loss will be addressed in a subsequent chapter or posting. Citizens then can now have equal benefit to these site value taxes with much improved infrastructure, healthcare, education facilities, and other social services. Site value taxes will be completely congruent with the user's ability to pay, as the taxes will be linked to realizable or realized market values of the sites themselves. What occurs today is that taxes are applied entirely indiscreetly, not based on ability to pay or whether the sites are marginal, at the margins of the economy, or central. In any boom-bust cycle, the marginal sites will fail first, and the economy will thereby contract as the bust period proceeds. There is no doubt that taxes based on the value of land is the least burdensome of taxes. Employment will go up to full employment, business startups would maximize and flourish, goods and services would increase in quantity and quality, and would be accessible to the majority, and general standards of living in the country would improve immeasurably. These goals must be the goals of all governments. The second canon. The second canon, according to Adam Smith, treats with ease and inexpensiveness in the collection of taxes. Because land lies out of doors and cannot be hidden, the ease and inexpensiveness of assessment and the application of the tax upon its value does not require large numbers of public officers to do such an exercise. The tax will fall upon the landowners and not necessarily tenants, who, because of limited choices today, must absorb all increases. Land valuations are much easier and more expeditious than property valuations. Also, property valuations are more complex in nature and more subject to inaccuracies and the whims and fancies of the valuators. This would less be likely the case for land valuations, where standards and uniformity could be adhered to. The third canon. There is no greater evil with current taxation systems worldwide than with their lack of certainty. Because of this, there is the tendency to evade or defraud the states of revenue. With imports, there is the tendency to under-invoice imported goods with personal and corporate tax returns. There is the tendency to be less and truthful in these statements. All this subterfuge is because of the lack of certainty of amount. In the current systems, there is substantial loss of revenue, and the state cannot really plan its expenditure programs effectively. A lot of manpower and material resources are consumed in the monitoring and mitigating for tax evasion and fraud. Large amounts of paperwork are necessary for assessment of returns, addressing tax disputes, and even the guarding of the coastlines against illegal imports. No doubt the cost to fund such a large administration of tax officials and processes is huge compared to the benefit of the tax intake itself, and may not be justified. A system based in the main on side value taxation will be decidedly simpler, more efficient, and more effective. Most importantly, there will be more eager participation as more taxpayers respond because of their ability to pay. This tax will also not tax the moral fiber of the community, as is the case currently, where compliance is observed in the breach through evasion and avoidance. The amount of tax to be paid is determined annually and is certain in amount. This can be paid in lump sum or in installments over the course of the year. This is certainly more desirable than the current system, where the more you produce, more tax take becomes applicable. Under side value taxation, taxpayers benefit from tax-free production, having met the tax obligation. With all the sites producing in this way, we can expect greater competition, lower prices, higher quality, more pay with purchasing power, and virtually zero unemployment. A virtual utopian situation. The fourth canon. The fourth canon is by no means the least important of the canons, in that it deals with equality with respect to payment of tax. It first seeks to dispel the fallacy that it is the individual or corporate entity that indeed pays the tax, when in fact it is the site that is responsible because of capacity to pay. To repeat, taxes are derived from the product of the factors land, labor, and capital. The value of the product per square foot varies whether the site is involved in commercial, industrial, residential, or agricultural activity. Each type of site has a different taxable capacity, and the tax authorities would do well to be aware of this. Clearly then, the site should be the focus when determining tax policy. Marginal sites such as agriculture or even industrial sites should not be taxed at the same rate as commercial sites, at say 35%, as is the case now in the United States. And because employment and capital invested at these sites are at best tenuous, they should not be taxed at all. Equality requires that taxes be imposed throughout the economy based on capacity or ability to pay. Taxable capacities on the various sites bear a remarkable relationship to the market values of these sites, because realized market values are the real evidence of ability to pay. Placement of these realized market values into the community's coffers instead of private hands will of course be a point of contention. The moral and ethical issues regarding this will be extensively examined in a separate chapter of these postings. Equality of taxation, then, can best be addressed if taxes are prescribed with respect to location and thereafter in relation to taxable capacity. Anything otherwise would be to apply taxes indiscriminately and to suffer the community unnecessary failure of its businesses, either small or large. Taxes should not be applied to wages, as wage levels are set for a category of work for the least the worker will accept at the most marginal site. When this marginal site goes out of business in the bust period, unemployment rises and wage levels may then be depressed, as this new marginal site sets a new wage level against the background of this growing unemployed pool. Wages then cannot withstand any taxation in this scenario, as they now must contend with rising prices of goods and services. Capital also begins to be out of the reach of individuals and businesses. Capital also begins to be out of reach of individuals and businesses, as the banks raise qualification criteria to access same in these times of stringency. With wages lacking purchasing power and capital inaccessible or unaffordable to the majority in the community, these are the classic conditions for an economy coming to a standstill, or at best having very little activity. The law of supply and demand for wages, interest, and rent. The law of supply and demand for wages, interest, and rent is like the law of gravity in that it cannot be denied. No number of platitudes or sentiments, wishful thinking, or even violent revolution can repudiate its operation. Wage levels are set by the number of persons in the marketplace offering the same service. It is also set by the number of sites available upon which labor can be employed. The more sites that are accessible is the higher will be the tendency of wages. If the number of accessible sites is limited, this will tend to push wages down. Notwithstanding the depression of wages, there will be a point below which wages will not go or not be accepted. This is the case for every category of work, unskilled, skilled, or professional, as each would have its own supply, demand, price equation. The same exists with the interest, the return on capital invested. The capitalist will not invest his capital if the return on the particular investment is below the bank interest rate, as it would be safer to just keep his money in the bank. Economic rent is also subject to the law of supply and demand. The more that sites of value are accessible for economic activity, the lesser would be the rents realized. When sites are held out of production, site values rise because demand for them rise. In this scenario, it is easy to see how wages would be depressed and capital prices become more expensive. As populations grow over time, it is easy to see how wages recede in value, which is the case today all over the world. This then is the secret ironclad law of economics for a successful society. Keep the sites of value open and producing by asking landholders to pay the economic rents inherent in all sites to the community in the form of a site value tax. This will keep the society producing and wealthy, and to do otherwise is to force the society to be founded on a platform of 3 legs with one of its legs broken. Eventually, the whole society will collapse, and we are beginning to see evidence of this throughout the world within recent times. How current taxation cripples growth and prosperity. The true problem with most economies throughout the world, whether they be developed or developing economies, is low productivity. A better way to measure how an economy is performing is by using the concept of added value. Added value can be measured in any type of economic undertaking, be it commercial, industrial, or agricultural, by adding the net product remaining after charges of labor and capital have been settled. As we know, wages and interest payments are the 2 most urgent obligations on a business concern, and the net product of the site then meets tax and shareholder dividend, etc. thereafter. Currently, taxation bears no reference to this net product. The same level of taxation is applied whether the site could bear it or not, whether the concern is located at the most active or central part of the economy, or whether it is at the fringes or at the margins. A marginal site will be unable to bear the tax and meet other obligations if it takes most of the net product. If this is the case, the site will soon go out of business and the economy will contract. This is the general case with all marginal sites. The system of taxation that must then lie at the heart of the matter, and it is here that the greatest wisdom must be applied if economies are to stay vibrant and productive. By now, the syndrome of economic collapse has become familiar throughout the world. Indiscriminate levels of taxation on entities with little regard to their taxable capacities are forcing them onto the margin and thereafter into bankruptcy. Those entities who can survive this onslaught seek to consolidate themselves into stronger central units, and some seek state assistance through grants, loans, subsidies, and other incentives. This lack of awareness of taxable capacity spirals a vicious cycle of mounting state handouts, having to be funded by ever-rising taxation on the more successful businesses in the economy. This increasing impost takes the form on the macroeconomic level as rising social security costs, increases in sales and value-added tax, corporate tax, and employment-based tax. These new imposts negatively impact employment, especially at the margin, and unemployment inevitably rises. Inflation then rises from the low production levels, and that ensues throughout the economy, and also because of the shortfall in goods and services produced. Just read that again. Inflation then rises from the low production levels that ensues throughout the economy, and also because of the shortfall in goods and services produced. This low productivity then leads to rising costs of imports which puts pressure on the country's currency, which then must be defended through rising interest rates. Government borrowing and debt to GDP ratio then become unmanageable over time, with real earnings never seeming to be able to meet real expenditure. This seemingly intractable situation has its genesis in a system of indiscriminate taxation. What is urgently needed is the establishment of an objective approach where taxation is only levied in relation to taxable capacity. This could be easily done by referring to historical data, or alternatively, by determining the market value or site value of the various sites through the economy. These site values bear a remarkable relationship to their taxable capacities once the taxes are levied in the right way. Two examples. There are two open examples of business operations in the United Kingdom which were able to pay all their tax obligations, corporate taxes, pay as they earn, PAYE taxes, etc., to their inland revenue departments without having to burden their employees. In other words, employees receive their gross pay without having any PAYE deductions made, except those for national insurance. What this did was unleash the latent productivity that was always there. This added productivity made up for any additional tax obligations that ensued. In the first example, Styleware, a clothing manufacturer of Merseyside in the northwest of England in 1973, recognized that it received far better productivity if it simply removed its employees' tax obligations and take this responsibility on itself. Its owner, Len Ferns, recognized that it was the business entity itself that had to meet and pay for all taxes attending its operation, whether they were corporate taxes, or PAYE. He saw that PAYE was really a corporate tax, masking as an employment-based tax. The payment obligation really falling to the operation. He also saw how PAYE was a disincentive to productivity, since increased production by the employee only moved his remuneration into a new tax bracket with only an incremental increase in take-home pay. Len Ferns realized that if he could pay his employees based on pieces of clothing produced, taking care of their PAYE tax obligations in the process, he could see a monumental shift in their level of productivity. For this purpose, he grossed up their remunerations, now paying their new tax obligations, but the additional revenue that this new level of productivity provided certainly made up the difference and more. The true taxable capacity was unleashed, and both labor and capital being satisfied with their returns. Another example of this breakthrough innovation in industrial management came in the wake of the success at Styleware by a similar clothing operation in Bradford, West Yorkshire, United Kingdom. Workwear Fashions, owned by Bill Finley, decided to introduce a tax incentive scheme in 1979 with the intention of improving productivity and the firm's bottom line. His business was this highly competitive industrial overalls business, which was facing stiff competition at the time from imports from the Far East. He, like Len Ferns, decided to convert gross pay into net pay and to use the work study and new manufacturing approaches into his operation, and he subsequently measured any increased productivity as the production achieved measured in standard hours and comparing it with the attendance hours available for production. This tax-free scheme improved attendance to around 90%, with only 10% attributable to absences for sick leave, bereavement, etc. Whereas in the past, a lot of supervisory time was used up in ensuring that production downtime was kept to a minimum. This new scheme, where workers were paid as per completed piecework, there were now complaints that cloth segments were not arriving fast enough. Too much time was now being spent having to untie batches of pre-cut cloth. The work supervisors now had to find innovative ways to keep the production line from stalling, which was entirely the opposite before. Both Bill Finley and Len Ferns agreed that motivation is the key to increasing productivity, and what better way to motivate than through the tax-free income scheme based on the amount produced. Both experienced a 30% increase in productivity, which easily took care of the increased tax obligation, and in Finley's case, a further 30% increase was achieved by providing a profit-sharing scheme. According to Finley, he said, "I am quite staggered at the rate of improvement. There is no doubt in my mind that the motivation has been produced by removing the tax barrier. There is no doubt that employment-based taxes are not only limiting employment opportunities, but also proving to be a disincentive to productivity. There is also the deleterious effect it is having on the operation's finances. For example, in the UK, for every £1 of take-home pay, gross earnings must be set to at least 25% more to meet income tax and national insurance obligations. These deductions are a barrier to productivity, especially when increased incomes only mean graduation into a new tax bracket. That labor is the cause of production, and not merely a cost of it, must be recognized, which is the traditional 19th century view of capitalism, where wages are seen as another cost to production, must be minimized like all other production costs as need be. A profit-sharing approach at best, or an untaxed wage approach at least, would give labor its rightful place as equal partner in the triumvirate of wealth production, and would unleash the productive power that is now dormant in all countries, whether developed or developing. In the Ferns and Finley experience, what was also found was that the attendance rates were up significantly, as workers took advantage of tax-free wages based on delivery of piecework. The more you worked, the greater the pay packet. Attendance remained at an astounding 98%, even through the Christmas holiday. This remarkable increase in productivity also revealed itself not only on the shop floor, but also amongst the managerial and mid-level staff. These staff also benefited from tax-free wages, were literally pulled by the ground floor staff to supply the necessary services in order that the supply chain not be lethargic or broken. They were also very partial to the profit-sharing scheme developed at Bill Finley's operation. To quote Bill Finley on his workers and the success at this scheme, when they have completed one job, they look around and get stuck into another. Previously, they would have clocked up excess time. I'm getting more production, they're getting more money, the revenue is getting more tax, and the customer a lower price. On this last point of the customer receiving a lower price, this can be explained by the substantial improvement in the overhead spread. This spread, which was calculated by dividing the normal labor running costs by the productive hours worked, which gave a value that was substantially lower in this new scheme than previous. This lower cost resulted in a lower price to the consumer. This increased productivity, which the new tax incentive scheme brought forth, allowed Ferns and Finley to take in new orders and increase its employment roles. Not only was absenteeism a thing of the past, but staff turnover was also low or negligible. Persons in the community hearing about the excellent conditions at these entities resulted in an extremely long waiting list of persons seeking employment. Imagine for a moment if most business operations in the community adopted this approach to tax and production management. What impact this would have on employment and wage levels. It bears restating that this approach underlines the lack of understanding that characterizes wage negotiations. The employees seek to maximize wage earnings, whilst the employer, having the view that wages are a cost to production and not the cause of it, seek to keep wages as low as possible. The real and unseen culprit in the barrier to productivity is the tax system. The simple fact is wages are derived from that very production, and intuitively, Ferns and Finley have determined this and succeeded in raising wages well above the industry norm, and at the same time reducing its aggregate value as a percentage of the total product value. The adversarial them and us approach to wage negotiations is now a thing of the past. The underlying economic truth that the side pays the tax and not the employee cannot be contradicted. This simple fact, recognized, would see unemployment, underemployment, and lack of productivity as all unnecessary and not based on indolence of the workforce, but ignorance of economic truth. You can get more on this subject by accessing our flagship course, Nature of Society, whose link is in the description profile bio. Thank you.